Good evening, everyone. I'm Edward Sullivan, and on behalf of the University of Toronto Men's Issues Awareness Society, I'd like to thank you all for coming out tonight. UTMIAS has been active at the University of Toronto since 2012, and one of our biggest projects since then has been bringing in a wide variety of speakers to talk about critical issues facing boys, men, fathers, and families. It's a slightly smaller group tonight, but honestly that's probably for the best. Considering the topic of this presentation, I'm sure there will be quite a few questions at the end. But I'd be remiss if I did not, Steve, if you can come up. If I didn't thank the Canadian Association for Equality for sponsoring these and helping us find speakers, helping us organize. Without them, we wouldn't be able to do that. So the leader of the Toronto branch of CAFE, Steve Legasky.
Thank you, Edward. Yes, the Canadian Association for Equality, CAFE for short, is an educational charity that seeks to include men and boys in discussions of gender. We also run something called the Canadian Centre for Men and Families in Toronto, which is a non-profit organization that offers legal support, counseling, and some other services for men who are in need of them. So we're sponsoring tonight's event. If you're interested in finding out about more events or more about CAFE, you can sign up at our sign-up sheet. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve. I don't think we actually have a usual table set up tonight, but anyone in the audience who is University of Toronto student or staff or faculty, you can get in touch if you'd like to be involved with UTMIAS through our Facebook page mainly. Usually we have a sign-up sheet, but not tonight. There will be about 45 minutes for the presentation and then 15 minutes or so for questions, depending on what everyone has. With the bookkeeping out of the way, I'd like to introduce Dr. Benjamin Roebuck. Dr. Roebuck, since he received his PhD in criminology at University of Ottawa, has done a wide variety of work focusing on things like homelessness and evidence-based crime prevention. At this point, he is a professor of victimology at the Algonquin College program, and you're the graduate coordinator?
Yeah, for the past 5 years, this year somebody else has taken on the admin, so I'm very happy.
All right, and you're involved in some research. You'll probably be able to give 2 sentences on that than I. So you have the floor.
Sure, thank you so much. It's nice to see everyone tonight. Like you said, I'm going to try to share what I can in 45 minutes, and then there's room for conversation and discussion. I'll mention that what I'm going to present tonight is really, really preliminary, and so your input and feedback is really welcome and helpful for me to better understand the work that we've been doing in Ottawa. So we're getting a security update. Exciting. Okay, so I'm Ben. You can call me Ben, please. I have a 5-month-old at home, so my mind is a little more loopy than usual. We have 2 other kids, but I'm in the early baby years right now, so forgive my incoherent babblings at times. I'll try to be as structured as I can. The project I'm going to be presenting tonight is a research project that we've been doing funded by SSHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. It's been 3 years and we're right at the end of year 3. And we've been talking with people across Canada from every province and territory about resilience and violent victimization. And so I'm going to present a bit about that tonight, and then we're going to focus specifically on some of the findings that we've been having around men, and I'll give a focus tonight on men's experiences of intimate partner violence, and then we can talk a little more broadly with the group. So I'm going to go through some of the fundamental concepts that are involved in our research project, and then we'll start to look at the data. So I have up on the drawing a bit of an ink blot, and this is clearly about perception, but to get us started, what are some of the things that you might perceive with this ink blot here?
Human pelvis.
A human pelvis, thank you. I thought that might be one of the first observations in a men's group. Yes?
I see 2 bears like on the sides.
Two bears on the side. Nice. Yes?
Cross section of the spine.
Oh, wow. Yes, I see it too. This is great. Others?
Vagina.
Thank you. Thank you. I came here to show you a picture of a vagina to start my research talk, so thank you. Yeah, others? I mean, every ink blot could, right? I think that's the point. So when you look at something like this, in this room, there's an infinite number of perceptions that you could have, taking in the exact same phenomenon. And when we start to look at responses that people can have to violence in their lives, one of the most important fundamental concepts is that everyone experiences it differently, and even within the same family, one event can happen, and every family member will have different reactions to that event, depending on their own personal perception. And so perception is really important to understanding both how people experience violence, the impact that it has, and also their trajectory through a healing and recovery process. Framed another way, we've got three pictures here, 3 little glasses. One says I'm half full, one says I'm half empty, and one says I think this is piss. So, you know, we all approach life with our own unique lens, and that will also influence how we perceive situations, okay? So, the final concept before I start to look at our research project here is what I call the victim-centered perspective, meaning, especially coming from a criminology background into the field of victimology, where we're looking at the experiences of victims and survivors of crime, one of the important things is that we construct our understanding of an issue from the lived experiences of people who've gone through them. And that becomes really important if we're going to talk about men's experiences of violence. What has their experience looked like? What's their lived reality? What are the obstacles and barriers that they experience when they're trying to get help? Because that's a valid experience that needs to be better understood and researched, and it has to be our starting point, is what are people saying about their own lives? So I'm going to talk about men victimization and resilience. I'll just highlight some of our project partners for this research: the Victim Justice Network, which is based in Toronto, the Ontario Office for Victims of Crime, which advises the Attorney General for the province on victim-related issues, the Canadian Resource Centre for Victims of Crime in Ottawa, Victims of Violence in Ottawa, the Algonquin Police and Public Safety Institute, and SHRC. All right. So when I say the word resilience, we're going to talk a bit about resilience. What are some of the concepts that come to mind when you hear the word resilience?
Bouncing back.
Bouncing back. That's a really common definition that's there.
Robust.
Pardon?
Robust.
That's also a good word. It's one of my favorite words, in fact. When I hear it, it makes me smile. So robust. There's something very rounded about that word. Yeah, all right. What else? I'm random, I promise. 5-month-old. Remember, 5-month-old. So robust, bouncing back. What else?
Backbone.
Backbone. Good. I like these words. Okay. The research kind of covers some of these things. So ability to bounce back. If you remember those old clown toys that you punch down and it's weighted in the bottom so it pops back up. Sometimes we can look at something like that. And in my previous research on youth homelessness and resilience, certainly that typology often comes in. You see these kids who get up every day and they're trying hard even though everything seems to be against them. And they just keep bouncing back. What I found is that moving into other types of violence, that some of that language seems a bit too superficial. So in this same study, we talked with about 85 people who'd experienced a homicide in their family. And so the language of bouncing back just doesn't fit with such a grave, serious situation where they say, I haven't bounced back at all, or the concept of elasticity. Well, what happens when the elastic breaks, right? And you have to start from the beginning. So it's important to understand that resilience looks different with different people, okay? It's been talked about as a process and outcome. A lot of this we can jump over. If you're more interested, I can give you a fuller explanation of resilience. One of the things that's most important here for our talk is that we're using a constructionist discourse on resilience. So rather than looking at an external observer saying, these are the things, my checklist for what resilience looks like in someone's lives, I want to know how people feel subjectively that they're doing okay, that they're doing well, and that they have a sense of personal well-being. And so it's grounded in an individual reality, and it's connected to perception, like we've been talking about. Okay? And this is more of a social work understanding versus a psychology understanding, and a dominant model coming out of Michael Unger's work, who's leading an international research center on resilience out of Dalhousie. So, two of the really important concepts within this subjective model of resilience, and we'll look at it when we start to talk about men's experiences, are navigation and negotiation. When something happens, when violence happens, when someone experiences violence in a relationship, all of a sudden there's this whole terrain of things that need to be navigated. And a person might make efforts to navigate towards resources that they believe are helpful, or they might negotiate with the people in their lives to try to get things that they feel are helpful. And so what's really important is that concept of agency, that when violence happens, it doesn't just happen to a person passively and then they're passively impacted. But every day, as someone experiences violence, if it's ongoing, or if something profound and sudden has happened, they're thrust into this environment where they're making all kinds of decisions, their choices. They're trying to say, how much am I going to tell to this person or not share with this person because I feel like it's in my better interest not to bring up the topic. And they're navigating and thinking through reflexively on this process. And we'll revisit that. So our project has looked at the experiences of victims of crime after violence, and their interactions with the justice system, with victim assistance services, and then their own informal support networks. And the other concept in here is post-traumatic growth. Are you familiar with the concept of post-traumatic growth? Anyone? Right. So at its simplest form, when people experience adversity, and Viktor Frankl is a really beautiful example of this, suffering, human responses to suffering have the potential to bring out the worst in us at times and to bring out the best in us. And the reality is, when people are pressed and when they experience difficult things in their lives, over time, as much as they might experience harm, it's also possible to reflect on the experience, to grow from it, and to come away feeling like there's been not thanks to it, but in spite of a situation, that there's some personal growth that's happened. And there's a number of mechanisms that researchers are looking at in terms of how that process takes place, but it's one of the other pieces we've been looking at in our project, okay? And so the study, to give you an overview, we spoke with people who'd experienced violence, who were not currently going through a court process, because that's a painful time. We didn't want to overburden people with more research questions or prying in that time. We spoke with people who were 18 or older at the time of the study, but they could still reflect on something that happened before they were 18. So that means that we also included people reflecting on childhood abuse, physical and sexual or other. Identified subgroups. We made an effort within the bigger study to do deliberate outreach, to hear from women who'd experienced violence, family survivors of homicide, and some specific outreach for male survivors. We were really thankful for the support of CAFE. Once CAFE had put out our request for research participants, within a couple of days we had more than 50 men who participated in the study, which was phenomenal. And so to give you a sense of what we're gathering, we ended up hearing from 457 people through the online survey, which was quite long. We're thankful that people filled it out. There's a lot of open-ended data within that survey. It included the post-traumatic growth inventory, so a questionnaire that looks at different indicators of post-traumatic growth. And we also looked at satisfaction with the criminal justice system. And I'll show you some of the scores that men had reported. And then we had open-ended questions, and this is really kind of the narrative of our research of following violence, what did you find to be helpful? What did you find to be unhelpful? What advice would you give to other survivors who've gone through a similar experience? How did the experience change you as a person? And then a question about labels, about what types of, when you think about your experience, do you use words like victim or survivor or other labels to describe your experience? Okay? So the online survey had 457 participants, and then we did an additional 70 in-depth qualitative interviews, either in person or by phone or Skype. And this ranged over a number of different types of victimization, so that each different type of victimization we were exploring would have a number of depth interviews as well as the online survey content. Okay? This is going to be a tiny little slide up here. I just want to highlight, this is the entire survey, and I wanted to show this because in a minute we're going to look at men's responses, particularly men who experience partner violence. So this is the overall responses for the people who had interacted with the justice system, because about 35% of the people who participated had never reported the incident. Then what you see here is overall, how would you rate your experience with the criminal justice system? Please review the statements below and rank from 1 to 10, or 1 to 5. So the satisfaction rates are up here. Overall, I was satisfied with the process or satisfied with the outcome. So 47% of people strongly disagreed that they were satisfied with the process of the justice system, and 45% strongly disagreed that they were satisfied with the outcome. Okay, keep that in mind, it's like the 45 bigger, okay? And then we asked about whether the prosecutor, they felt like the prosecutor had believed them, the police had believed them, whether they felt like they were respected, that their security, identity, and privacy were respected, that they were kept informed. And so we measured all of these things, and we can look at them across different types of victimization. Okay? And so as a researcher, a number of things stood out, and this is the last slide before we start to get into some of the male partner violence data. I've learned, you may believe it or not, that researching violence against men can be a little politically controversial at times. Surprise! And I'm so curious about why that is. And so as we're going through this project and as we continue to share, and this is really one of our first presentations on this data, but over the next few years as we're publishing, I want to keep track of what some of the types of resistance that we encounter, because I think it's so valuable to learn from. And I'm really interested in how we can help to bridge the understanding of men's issues into our dominant victim services sector and the justice system so that there's a better response when survivors do come forward. All right. So if we look at the cases of partner violence, where people reported partner violence in our study, there was 160 cases of partner violence that were reported, 113, so 70% from women, and about 30% of the partner violence cases in our study were from men, so 47 cases of partner violence. And this is just, wasn't a case of partner violence, it's separated out now, all the data will be separated for just the men who are responding, so 100% yes, because it's 100% of the men who experienced it. The gender of the person who was the abuser, in 97% of the cases in this sample, they were women, and then in one case only, it was a case of same-sex partner abuse. Okay? And we were talking at dinner about how sometimes there's more openness to talking about partner violence in the LGBT community than looking at heterosexual relationships and female abusers. Yes?
Yeah, gay relationships that were rarer than straight ones, so has that been taken into account somehow?
Yes, so this is not representative in any way of the actual trends in society, so that's a very good question, and I should have given that caveat. This is just the people who responded. We did make effort to reach out to LGBTQ stakeholders in the study, and would have better response rates to different types of questions. We didn't get a lot of responses to the intimate partner violence questions. But so it's not reflective of society. I'm just telling you that our data is speaking to experiences that heterosexual men have had in violent relationships where they have been abused. Yes.
Can you elaborate what you mean exactly by violence?
Yes, I can. With a slide perhaps even. Here we go. So with partner violence, these are the types of violence that people have reported. So this was a mark all that apply. What kind of violence or abuse was it? About half had experienced threats of violence. It could have been to them, to their loved ones or pets. 80% of the men reported that they'd experienced physical violence from their female or one male partner. 20% reported sexual violence. Emotional and psychological abuse, 80%. And really this is an interesting one because the nature of violence is different in some of the relationships where some men reported serious injuries, but what I more commonly heard from men when we were talking was that the physical violence wasn't as problematic to them personally as the emotional abuse and controlling behavior. And that can actually be similar and different from female experiences of partner violence, where it's easier to recognize, or society is more willing to recognize emotional abuse of females than they are of men. So a lot of men who experience really damaging emotional abuse, for sometimes, like some cases where I've been married for 40 years and this has been ongoing, then, you know, they felt really alone with what was going on, or there was an assumption that there must be something wrong with them. Yeah. Some harassment, stalking, destruction of property, or damage of property. There was a case where a wife had tampered with her husband's engine, and he's big into cars, and so that was an extra big deal. And financial or economic abuse, and then a few other behaviors that were mentioned. So we see that the full range of types of violence that women might experience in relationships, men can also experience in violent relationships. The same types of controlling behaviors and manipulation, threats, abuse, physical, sexual violence even. And so it raises interesting questions about the rationales and the explanations that we use for understanding the motivations behind partner violence. Because if we look at violence against women, the dominant rationale and methodology of understanding it would be that the motivation for violence is rooted in patriarchy, and that it's a gender-based form of violence. And from our research, and I'll be able to tell better when we've gone through the 110 cases that are women in our study, sometimes that's absolutely true. We know that sometimes men have derogatory attitudes towards women or feel entitled, and that can play into some of their controlling behaviors and manipulation. But if we look at the same behaviors happening between men and between women, there have to be other explanations for why partner violence exists. And some of the explanations that are used in therapy would be emotional regulation. From the time that girls are little, we train them to talk things out. And from the time that boys are little, we say things like boys will be boys, or we let them fight it out on the playground with another boy because we know that after that it's gonna, like, the problem will be less, or that kind of thing. And I think society is changing on some of those indicators, but there's some differences in the way that we socialize boys and girls to process emotion. And so when it comes to dealing with intense feelings and anger and conflict, often boys haven't had the same emphasis in their socialization on processing those things that women might have had. Question here and then in the back. Yeah.
In your study, was there any account taken for how many of these relationships had reciprocal violence?
That's a really, really good question, and the answer, unfortunately, is no. So yes, he asked, is there an accounting in our study for the relationships that have reciprocal violence? What I can say is that from reviewing the data, that of the 47 cases, and this is, like I said, this is still preliminary, we haven't gone through everything in great depth. I'd say that probably 2 of them would give me a concern that the person who was writing about their experience was possibly the primary abuser. But there's certainly really clear evidence in many of the other cases that they took great effort never to cause some of those actions. And I'll give some examples, yeah.
In light of what you're saying and what you said about the socialization process,
yeah.
Is there a difference in the dispersal of the kinds of acts of violence between males and females?
Yeah, so I haven't gone through all of the female data in this yet. because it's quite new that we're able to start pulling out the data. We would see more women seeking medical attention for injuries from partner violence. That would be a difference. But a lot of the qualitative descriptions of the experiences might be really similar. Like an example of a male stalking a partner using social media and monitoring what they're doing and who they're spending time with, and a female monitoring what their husband or boyfriend are doing and showing up at their house because they saw on social media that they were in the same place as this other girl that they didn't like, and making a scene there. So there really are so many parallels, but there's some differences that are quite pronounced that I want to come to in a couple of minutes. Yeah. Was there another question here?
I was going to ask, sort of turn into that question, about the use of weapons. Was there, my intuition, and I may be wrong, is that women would use weapons more, whereas men being stronger wouldn't feel the need to, or
Yeah.
was that shown in data?
That's a really interesting question. I haven't looked at the qualitative data for the women, which would be where I learned what they were saying. If I look just at the men's experiences, there would be cases of being hit with a baseball bat or with a pressure hose.
I hear a lot about knives as well.
Yeah, I didn't see too much. There were definitely some people who talked about knives, like maybe 2 cases where they talked about knives. Not that they were necessarily injured with them, but that they were drawn on them. I suspect that there was more than those 2 cases. And then there were some injuries and hospitalizations, skull fractures, and a few other things, but it may not have been, well, I guess something would have been used in that case. Yeah. So I can't make any kind of comparison in that way. Yeah.
Anecdotally, I think, and I'm asking the question if you find that men are typically victimized on their face, and women are victimized not on their face.
Yeah, it depends. So if we look at from a criminology lens, the typology of men who abuse, there's different characteristics, and if you were to profile, there's kind of more of the emotional regulation and losing control and getting angry and being combative, and it's not that strategic. And then there's a really calculating, manipulative type that if they're doing abuse, they're intentional about hiding it, and like it's on the torso where it's not going to be visible and that type of thing. There was a guy in the study, really big guy. We did a qualitative interview. He's probably like 6'1.5". Like he's a big guy, and so he says, if my wife punches me in the face, I don't really care. It doesn't hurt that much. And so there's a difference in terms of the impact of physical violence with the strength of the person who's doing it.
Yeah, many men are socialized from childhood never to hit a woman.
Yes.
So I think many men, when faced with violence by women, simply walk away or deal with it without physically fighting back.
Yeah, and the other side of that is that if you watch 80s and 90s movies especially, women are socialized that it's fine if a man insults you, you can slap him, right? Like it's actually like, and it's in so much popular media. It's in shows like Freaks and Geeks. My favorite. There was only 1 season. I'm so sad. But this girl just beats up her boyfriend in there, and it's just her venting her rage. And so there are differences in what's communicated, certainly in popular media, even around violence. So I certainly heard from men that exact notion that like it's wrong for me to hit my partner, so I just had to take it. And a really strong phrase that came out of that was "put up or shut up." So you got to put up with it, or you just shut up. And so I saw a lot of evidence of men regulating their behaviors and finding ways to deflect the violence or to monitor it and document it. Yeah. Yes?
Well, I was going to say, it's also really hard for a man to fight back even if he wants to, because if he hits a woman back and she gets like a bruise on her face, she could go to the police and say he hit me first, and 9 out of 10 times they're gonna believe her.
Okay, you're bringing it up now, so we'll just go to it. That's absolutely brilliant, all right? And that's a really significant reality that men report on. So I'll start with a caveat that one of the challenges about data in partner violence is that when the police are called to a couple that are having a dispute, and they're not going to be honest, they both have a vested interest in convincing the police of something, right? And from the cases of women who experience partner violence, it's very common that their abusive partner will tell them that they will say that they were hit too, or that the woman was the aggressor, right? We know that happens on the other end, especially. But the challenge with data is if we do a victimization survey, like we were talking earlier about, there's one that shows, 50% men and 50% of women experience, that of the people who experience partner violence, the 50% are men and 50% are women. Now, if you have an abusive man who's abusing his wife and his wife fights back, and you call to do the GSS and you do a victimization survey and you say, in the past 12 months, have you been hit, kicked, or scratched by your partner, or whatever the long list of questions is, the man says yes, because he's been abusing someone and they've been fighting back, right? And so the numbers are prone to all kinds of error, and it's really difficult to get an accurate representation of what's actually happening, especially without a reciprocal test like what you asked earlier. And the GSS doesn't do that. So if we look at men's experiences, yes, they get the threat of false accusation, but it's really when women are abusive and manipulative, they're in these cases that have been reported, they're very conscious of the bias in the system to treat them as the victim, right? And so there were so many examples of men talking about their partner threatening them with false accusation, and they ranged in severity. There was a man who woke up to his wife hitting him while he was sleeping in bed, and she had her phone already dialed with 911 to report him that he was assaulting her. There was a case where a woman had thrown a burning cup of coffee on her husband in front of their child and called 911 and said that he'd assaulted her. The child was present and also, said that it was not his dad's fault, but that assumption was there. And in one quite more extreme case, there was a man who talked about having firearms in his house that were on the long gun registry. So they were registered, and because of the ongoing abuse, he was really concerned that his wife would say that he had threatened her with the firearms. So he contacted the registry, let them know that he was moving them out of the house. He let the Canadian Mental Health Association know that he was moving them out of the house, and a few other community partners that had been involved with their family. And after about a year and a half or 2 years, she filed a false threat saying that he had threatened her with firearms from their house, but she didn't know that he had moved them. And so the similar. This is a similarity around false threats that people often, if they're going to try to get access to justice, that they unfortunately have to document everything. And so there were examples of men letting their coworkers hear text message or showing text messages that were threatening, letting them hear voicemail that was threatening from their partner, to bring other people into that circle of who knew that the violence was going on. And that was a really important strategy that men talked about, that they didn't want in the advice for other survivors, saying try not to go through it alone, but also to use caution in who you talk to. So if we look at health conditions prior to and after violence, we asked people if they had experienced different health conditions before violence and after, and what we see is that about 45% of men reported that they had experienced a mental health condition following violence. If you look at it, it could be PTSD, it could be depression, anxiety, panic disorder, and a number of other trauma-related mental health conditions. There were just 2 cases where they talked about an ongoing physical disability. That number is higher with the women, but there were 2 men in the sample who had long-term health implications because of physical violence.
Were they physical implications or mental?
I think at least one of them, I can't think of the other, is acquired brain injury. The man had experienced a fractured skull. Yeah. So when it comes to the justice system, so these are the men who experienced partner violence, and we asked them about if they had interacted with any of these people in the justice system. So about half of them, 52%, had interacted with the police. And I'll show you in a minute what they thought about those interactions. 34% in criminal court, 30% in family court. But right here I want to show 45% didn't interact with the justice system at all. And these are some of the men who might either still be in a violent relationship or they've left it, they've tried to move on. Sometimes people have experienced shame around that violence to the extent that they haven't talked about it before. And I had men in our study disclose for the very first time incidents of violence that had happened to them, where they expressed gratitude for the survey because they'd never talked about it, and there were some serious incidents in there. So if we come back to those same satisfaction questions that we looked at earlier in the study, we'll start by the questions around the police. You'll see that there's greater dissatisfaction for sure about whether the police kept them informed, respected their privacy and security, if they were respectful or if they were believed. This is 58% of men who were in contact with the police strongly disagreed that they were believed. And in practice, what was reported, and this is really troubling, are men that were where their partners had followed through and made false accusations against them, and sometimes in very bizarre circumstances, and men who were arrested or men who had called the police. Read 3 or 4 cases today of men who had called the police because they were being assaulted and they were arrested. And so we need better training and assessment protocols for these situations. One man talked about the man who had coffee thrown on him. He experienced many other things with his partner, but in that incident, one police officer spoke with the wife and one spoke with him and the child. And the first police officer wanted to arrest him, and the other one was finally able to convince him that nothing had happened. Even so, he was asked to leave the house for the day. And so we see often that even when men might be believed, that sometimes the restrictive provisions are still put on them rather than on their partner.
Did he leave with the child or with it?
So he was trying to take the child to school with her car, and she called the police to say that she'd been assaulted and that he was trying to leave their home with her child. And so he was allowed to take the child to school, and he was supposed to leave for the day.
So in an instance like that where the behavior is obviously severe,
Yeah.
does it not come to mind almost immediately that this person has a mental health problem?
Yes.
And the woman in this case. And so what, as you're describing these cases, I mean, I can imagine that there are people who don't know how to negotiate difficulty.
Yes.
And occasionally it explodes on them.
Yes.
And then there are other people who maybe have possibly a more severe model or problem with their model of the world or themselves,
Yeah.
whatever it might be, and
Yeah.
it's a very deep-seated issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what I saw, which is interesting in terms of the rationale, is that men were most likely to describe their partner's abuse as mental health challenges. So to see the primary reasoning for them being abused as connected to their partner's poor mental health. And there could have been diagnoses or personality disorders or things like that. But in almost every case, if a man was to talk about why he was being abused, it was because his partner had a mental health condition. Now, if we look at the dominant discourse around violence against women, it's not typically mental health that is the explanation. It's the causal factors connected to men in society or toxic masculinity or whatever it's going to be. And so I think that in bringing the conversation together and looking at intimate partner violence, because there's so many similarities across the genders, that it's actually a way to give resistance and clarity to the bigger discourse around what are the reasons that we experience violence in society. Because some of the explanations are a little too easy, and they don't fit with the complexity of every case. And so yes, mental health can be involved, and yes, there's men who abuse out of a challenge with mental health or obsessive compulsive disorder and controlling behavior. Those two go together really strongly. And so I think the questions that we see when we look at men help us to better understand the issue. And that's typically what happens. In social science, if we only look at a portion of the cases, we're going to draw different conclusions than if we look at all the cases together. And so if we can really bring the violence that men experience into the bigger picture and look at intimate partner violence as a whole, then we're going to come up with different explanations and causes and understandings of why these things happen and what are appropriate responses. Yeah.
Now, this is obviously a satisfaction survey, this question.
Yes.
Were you able to get any data that you have available at this point as to the specific behaviors people were encountering from police, from prosecutors, that kind of thing? Because of course, it might be that the behaviors men and women are encountering are completely different. It might be that men and women all respond to these things differently, so some of the things may cause men to feel greater dissatisfaction with it than women, or vice versa. That kind of,
Yeah, there's actually quite a bit of qualitative data where men talk about their experiences with police, both positive and negative. And I'll just move ahead and then I'll speak to that here. So I'll just show the final picture to get this in mind. So the Crown prosecutors did marginally better than the police, though it's still quite bleak in terms of them feeling like they were believed and protected. But if we look at the satisfaction scores here, for men who experience partner violence, 75% here, and like the numbers on this end don't get very high, right? 75% strongly disagreed that they were satisfied with the outcome, 79% strongly disagreed that they were satisfied with the process. And when we run some statistical testing on that, very preliminary, on the satisfaction scores with just looking at men, not even the partner violence, just men and women, there's a statistically significant relationship between the men's dissatisfaction scores and the women's. Women are not overly satisfied with the system either, particularly in partner violence and particularly in sexual violence. But if we look at the men who are experiencing these things, the scores dissatisfaction are much higher. It's a statistically significant difference. And then they tell us explicitly about not being believed, about police officers arriving in a rush and making an arrest before they've listened to one side of the story, and a number of those types of things. Yeah. Yes.
How do you deal with the issue of truth? He said, she said.
Yeah. Can you deal with that? Yeah. That's what police officers have to do. So before we're like too critical on our police, I work in, I teach in police foundations as well. It's a tough job, you know. As a criminologist, I'm very quick to criticize police sometimes, but now that I work with a lot of them, how would you differentiate when you come in and you have a man and a woman and they're both telling you different accounts of what happened and where this bruising came from and all that type of stuff? It's difficult. And you have two adults who are smart with a vested interest in lying to you. That's difficult. And so, there's some work that's been done on risk assessment and that type of thing, but the reality is we will always misjudge some cases because it's too difficult to get right all the time.
Well, I asked the question because I think at the crux of the hashtag, conundrum that's been going on for the last few months, is that how do you know who's telling the truth? I mean, people have been brought down from high positions all over the place.
Yeah.
And it's pointing fingers and said, and we choose to believe one side or the other.
Yeah.
And I don't know how again, to me it seems the crux of a huge problem. How do you decide who's going to be believed?
Yeah, and the challenge of like removal of position before it's gone through a court, and all of the consequences of a guilty finding can happen before it's ever been before a judge. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking actually of the Paul Bernardo and Carla Holoka case where, I mean, you know, it seemed to be so easy to believe that, of course, Carla Holoka might have been somehow forced into some set of actions. And I think later on, there was this realization of the enormity of the mistake.
Yeah.
And what I'm wondering is basically whether you think that we have like kind of a natural proclivity to think that, you know, boys, you know, snails and puppy dogs' tails and girls spice and everything nice. Is this something that we're kind of hardwired to have, or is it something that we're sort of socialized to believe? And is that part of what distorts this way of perceiving the truth?
Yeah, all of the above. I think if we look at gender difference in society on the whole, we typically see more aggression from males, whether that's socialization or hormones or any number of things. It's like a classic conversation in a criminology intro class that we recognize there's differences in gender, but because we know that those differences are there, we tend not to recognize when women are violent or responded appropriately. That archetype of a woman who is nurturing and that whole idea of hegemonic femininity, that women are like this and men are like this, then sometimes we don't respond in the same way to a woman as we would to a man, even if they've done the same thing with the same degree of violence. We certainly don't impose the same consequences. And there are different considerations around gender roles that might be at play in that relationship, around who's caring for the children and what role does that play. And there's assumptions all the time about women being maternal, and not all women are maternal. And so certainly men in our study also talk about the challenges of going through family court in these cases, these partner violence cases where women were using that process to manipulate and control their partner. Because when it comes to the kids, the fathers really cared. You know, for men who didn't have children, often they advise, get out if you can, try to recognize the signs, talk to friends who can help you realize the violence that's actually going on, because you may not realize it yourself. But if you have kids, it's difficult because you want the best outcomes for your kids, and some fathers are willing even to plead guilty to things that they haven't done if it means that they'll still have access to their kids. And that's difficult. Yeah.
So then what was the ratio of, from the sample, of men who were charged, men who were insisted on, men who had children?
Yeah.
They're interesting.
Yeah, I don't have reliable data on that, unfortunately. Because this was a bigger study where we're looking at all different types of violence with the same lens or types of questions. I can look at qualitative data when people told me, but we didn't set out to explicitly look at that one issue. So this is an area I'd be very interested in a follow-up study, and to build in some of those things and controls for counter-violence and that kind of thing as well. And look at children and family court and all of that in more depth. We have some data, but not exhaustive.
Not anything accurate.
Yeah, exactly. It'd be all anecdotal in that way.
Have you found any cultural differences in terms of if men from certain cultures will have less tolerance towards women's violent behavior rather than other cultures?
There was one man in the sample, this group, who was black, who used a really derogatory term about himself as an explanation for why his partner could do whatever she wanted. And so he was kind of saying, like, there's like that sense of already being disenfranchised when the justice system is coming into play. And so now if we layer on, I'm a man and I'm black and the police are coming to talk to me about partner violence, that he felt like that was an added obstacle. The sample that we have here is predominantly white as well. And so we don't have as much of that ethnicity data. Yeah.
So to me, that's quite an interesting question, and I'm not sure it was answered exactly the way that you intended, because when you first raised it, like I work in IT, I work with people from all over the world, and I'll tell you right now that I would be one of the very few people who were born and raised in Canada, actually on the floor where I work.
Yeah, sure.
So when you have lunch with these people and you talk about everyday occurrences, like just what went on a few days ago, this kind of stuff, you really do hear quite a different variety of responses to things. And when it comes to the kind of violence that we might be talking about here, in some cultures, I don't think it would even register. And in other cultures like our own, it might be many things would register, many things would be seen quite differently.
Yeah.
So when you're presenting information like this, what I'm wondering is to what degree it's been kind of almost Canadianized, if you will, where it creates this sort of veil.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that in any way that makes it inaccurate or not useful,
Yeah.
but to raise the question, like, how applicable is it going to be in maybe, parts of China or parts of India or wherever else?
Yeah. Well, even in Canada, I mean, this is first of all a very Canadian study, and we usually hear from people right across the country. In the bigger picture, we heard from lots of visible minorities and ethnic minorities on different issues, more on some issues than others. A bit more on sexual abuse, and about 40 of the 300 or of the 450 were Indigenous, and there's lots of areas, and we'll actually go through and look at those cases by race and ethnicity as well. So we'll look at people who were born outside of Canada, and people, and analyze then across the different types of violence, what were the impacts and all of that. But if you think about research like this, like taking a giant spotlight and shining it on Toronto, right? Suddenly there's a light on something, we're looking at it, but there's so many tall buildings that are going to cast shadows where we can't see. And that's where follow-up research projects can go and look behind those buildings and try and build a more complete picture until you've got a Google map of the whole city, right? So really there's limits to the amount of research that's been done in Canada on partner violence against men. And so there's always more to learn. And I think this is giving us an indication of areas where we can look further. Yeah. Yes.
In addition to tracking race, did you also track religion?
Yes, we did. Did we also look at religion in addition to race? Yeah, and we'll go through again and look at if there's any perceivable difference through religion. We can also run some statistical analysis in different types of violence and correlate it to different outcomes in terms of post-traumatic growth and satisfaction with the justice system. There's certainly some mentions of race and satisfaction and believability, that kind of thing. Right? Yeah.
I just want a little caveat there.
Yeah.
Be very careful about forming too many generalizations and stereotypes.
Yes.
Because ideally we're looking for universal truths rather than.
And again, like any of that type of stuff is, because this isn't a representative sample, is really just to point us to look in different directions. You don't actually learn much about the intersection of race and violence until you go into the data and look for it explicitly. And so, having looked at the overall data, there were things I hadn't seen until we started to look at race, and then I'm like, oh, here's this woman talking about being black and feeling like that's impacting her attempt to get access to services. And so, that doesn't mean that that's the definitive story, but it means that there's a perception there that's powerful that we want to further investigate. Yeah.
There is, I was not born here, obviously, by my accent. And I did not know that women and men were not equal in the culture I come from. There was full equality. But what I think plays a role here is also the overall conception of tolerance, which is very good. But it also can be sometimes can have some disadvantages because, we're in Toronto, we're here from different cultures.
Yeah.
And certain women from certain cultures by coming to Canada, are already perceived as victims.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true.
And while their spouses are demonized.
Yeah, that's right.
So this is because we have been taught to be empathetic and to sympathize with women outside Canada, and I worked on women issues
Yeah.
and child marriages issues.
Yes, yeah.
So we were like, and this is natural sympathy and compassion that we can feel, but we forget that when they come here, they live in different circumstances. The laws here are different. They have access to protection, and one of the results is that for some women it becomes safe to be violent, exploiting this perception.
Yeah, yeah,
So that's why I think that this is also like an important angle.
yes, yes.
Because also what you said about the patriarchal models
Yeah.
and the women's reaction, the men's reactions, maybe some of the men's reactions to violence come from the same patriarchal model.
Exactly.
I'm strong, I'll go away from that.
Exactly, yeah.
So it's the same thing. And
Yeah.
then for me, something very interesting is what is this analytical framework that you create
Yeah.
so that you really go into the depth of the violence against men, and we're able to convince the public, the general public, that men also deserve compassion and that this is a big issue. And my last comment is that when you spoke a lot about physical violence, but I have 2 points here. I like the importance of emotional, financial, and economic violence, and also when does this violence occur? Sometimes it may not be so pronounced during the marriage, but it can escalate during the divorce and separation and divorce.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the consequences on the man are like they deprive them being fathers, of caring fathers. They can lose their jobs. A woman who gets an ex-parte restraining order against her husband, who is a social worker, this means that this guy cannot be a social worker anymore.
Yeah, yeah,
So I think this is also part of that cycle of violence
absolutely.
that can strengthen the case for.
Yeah, very insightful, very interesting. Yeah, I think there's so many threads there, like men might report a responsibility to stay in the violence because they believe that they're the head of their home, and that they should be able to manage it and be responsible for the outcomes. You'll have on the opposite, sometimes women believe that they need to submit to their husband, and so they need to stay in a violent relationship in that way, right? So there's different messages that can have the same impact, but the messages themselves sometimes have gender assumptions and beliefs that are built into them, right? I have a colleague at Correctional Service of Canada who's just released a study looking at the characteristics of women who are in prison for abusing their partners, which is another big picture, another piece of the big picture, right? Okay, my timekeeper, we're right near our end, hey? This has been a nice chatting group. Okay.
I mean, we've probably got time for 2-3 more questions.
Yes?
When you were talking about violence perpetuated by the partner against the male, the perception on the male part, I think you mentioned, was more psychological or had a mental health issue associated with it. And then you moved on and you mentioned the word or the phrase excessive masculinity.
Oh, toxic.
The toxic masculinity. Without connecting it with mental health, I thought that was very interesting because surely that's a symptom of some kind of mental health issue. But yet you seem to be segregating it. I wonder if you could just expand on that thought.
Yeah, so I was talking about the kind of the conception of violence emerging from power and control. And so one of the models of understanding violence against women, that men have been socialized to believe that they're superior or that they have the ability to exercise their will over women. And you can certainly see some relationships where that's the case. And so that can be seen as an example of socialization rather than an explanation that's rooted in mental health. It's possible that they intersect, but that intersection is not often made. Even in a case where somebody might have obsessive compulsive disorder, like I mentioned, and their controlling behavior is excessive. There's a role for discussing mental health in that. Yeah.
So I have two brief questions, if I may. One of them is that I think I heard you suggest earlier tonight that by dint of you studying men suffering under these circumstances, you might actually be on slightly more fertile ground because you don't have to kind of carry with you the burden of the orthodoxy of the same study if you were studying women.
Yeah.
Do you feel that way?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. That was beautifully framed. Yeah.
The other question, thank you very much for that.
Yeah.
You're making me blush.
Great.
The other thing I would wonder is whether there's not something to be said for the role of, if you will, I'll call it the isolation of the household. And the reason I bring this up is because, and again, like working with people from all over the world, it is very common for them to have other people living with them in the home, okay? My wife and I have our worst fights when there's no one around, okay? And what I wonder is whether that sort of like slightly broader society, whether it's our son or my parents or someone from her family, doesn't really help kind of not insulate, but it creates a control mechanism or a checking mechanism to prevent spillovers, if you will.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And again, I couldn't speak to it with this data, but it's a really interesting hypothesis to explore. Yeah, that you know, there's obviously cultural difference, and I think both in the experience of violence and in the perception of it. But that also is in our broad culture. So maybe I can close by mentioning a man who had reported having a lot of controlling behavior, his finances, his time being cut off from spending time with his friends. He'd been locked in the basement by his partner, locked out of the house. He'd been attacked with a pressure sprayer. He'd been hit with a baseball bat. With the baseball bat, when he was being attacked, the child was present, and she was hitting him and saying, "Stop hitting me." And it was the child who's saying, "Mom, you're hitting Dad." And so he had all of these experiences, and then when we're having this conversation, he's like, "I don't know if I qualify for your study." He didn't perceive those things as violence. It just, for some people, even the messaging that you know, violence against women is a thing, that men abuse women, for men it can be harder to recognize that what they're experiencing is abuse. It's challenging for women sometimes to recognize what they're experiencing is abuse. And what we're hearing from men is that they're saying it's hard to see it and for others to validate it and to know that that's what's happening. But I do think that we're moving in a hopeful direction. I think that calling attention to this really important issue has potential to move things. And two happy indicators that we were talking about over dinner. One, in our Police Foundations program, one of the first things that our students talk about as a training topic is wrongful conviction. And that's kind of a foundation going in, and if we can continue to think that way, we want to protect against wrongful conviction. That will help to make better decisions in the field. And finally, the Ontario government is looking to revamp the victim services training package for all victim services in the province. And one of the things that's in the bid, so to speak, one of the things that they want to see improved in the victim training package is responses for men who've experienced violence. And so I'm really hopeful that as that continues to grow and progress, and as groups like yourself are meeting and calling attention to these issues, that things can improve and that we can get better responses for men who are experiencing violence, and that there can be some compassion. And so, yeah. Was that before or after June? Probably after June. But I want to thank you for your time and attention tonight, and for what you're doing, and for incredible questions. Thank you.
Now, I wanted to ask quickly, how much of your prepared material do you have left at that point? Because we kind of ended up into the questions early on.
Oh, sure. I just had like just a couple things left to show. It doesn't matter really. Well, I can show you if you want to see. Just different sources of support that men were looking for. A lot of people were talking with family and friends, not as likely to access victim services, and men talked about a suspicion or fear of reaching out to services in case at any point a service provider thought that they were the abuser and initiated a CAS intervention or other things like that. Still 25% didn't interact with services or talk with friends or family about what was going on. And then finally, we had asked everyone in the study if they used words like victim or survivor to talk about their experience or other labels. And so for the men here, about 17% used the word victim, 34 survivor, and some others gave different explanations. That in itself is a really interesting area that we'll explore across the whole study at a different time. But there's a lot of power in those labels and why they're used and why they're not used. So
Can you excuse me for just two
Yeah.
questions, quickly,
Yes.
specific, but do you plan to publish this and when?
Yeah.
And how, from your perspective, how reliable is the data?
Yes. So, yes, we plan to publish it sometime in the next 2 years. I'm going on parental leave in the fall, so I'm very happy about that. The reliability of the data is quite strong because it's a mixed method study, so it has quantitative measures and qualitative measures. There would be some flaws with, until we clean it up right now, like maybe 1 or 2 cases that would just change the percentages, but the overall direction of any of those won't change. And then the qualitative data is very strong, and there's full interviews that we did with men who experienced partner violence as well. Yeah, I think it's quite reliable, and we've got a good research team that's looking at it. So some good news. Yeah. All right.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Very nice having you talk to everyone.
Thank you so much.